I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. These are actually the words that begin the Ten Commandments that we find in the book of Exodus. You know, Moses up on the mountain receiving the Ten Commandments from God. Maybe you remember that. Anyway, it starts out the Ten Commandments. Now maybe you're thinking, no, Brian, the Ten Commandments start with thou shalt not and all this stuff, but it actually doesn't. It starts with this. It starts with this reminder. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. It begins with a reminder of who's speaking. It begins with a reminder of who is inviting us into covenant. I am the Lord your God. It's not God boasting. It's not saying, I'm this God, look at me. It's God saying, this is the God that I am. See, you gotta remember that in this time, to have other gods wasn't unusual. I mean, it's kind of why God decides to say, have no other gods besides me, right? Because other people had gods, and well, sometimes we still do. We don't call them gods per se, but well, we treat them a lot like gods, don't we? But it makes me think about why God needs to identify God's self this way. Maybe it's because as it begins, as this relationship, this covenant begins with these commandments, God is reminding Moses, reminding us, that everything that God does is to set us free again. It's to set us free from what we've come to call as the church slavery to sin and death. God is a God of freedom, not a God of prosperity, not a God of wealth and all those other things that we like to think sometimes God is. God is a God of freedom, a God of opportunities, a God of love, a God of hope. And so we have this initial identity offered. I am the God who brought you out of slavery, out of the house of Egypt. Don't mistake me with any other God. Worship me. Worship me, not something else. Now, you know where the story goes, right? Of course, they do start worshiping somebody else. Aaron, Moses' brother, gets a little bit impatient. And so does everybody else, waiting for God to come through. Maybe that sounds a little familiar. Sometimes we get a little impatient too. And so they decide to make a golden calf and begin to worship that as their God. It's funny how that even after that, not that long after God says, you shall have no other God beside me, God continues to be in relationship. Why? Because God is interested in freedom. And when we turn back, when we forget, when we fail, when we fall short, God is still interested in that same freedom from sin, from death. And so my hope for you, as you're listening to this, as you're watching this, is that you'll know that the God who we worship is a God who brought our ancestors out of the house of Egypt, out of slavery, and who delivers us from temptation, from sin, from evil, from death, that we might discover the freedom and the joy of life with God. Amen.